Sri Aurobindo is describing how, in the path of integral knowledge, we have to put into practice both the principle of renunciation and of concentration. And he is leading us to a practical form in which this can be developed as a discipline. But in leading to the practical form, we have to see how these two different aspects are synthesized in practice and experience, and then we will give form to it in specific steps. In the chapter that we have been studying so far, he has described how, in the traditional approach, one steps back from the identification with the body, life and mind, recognizing that there was an error in our soul's identification with these things, to feel ourselves exclusively body or life or mind or even a combination of these three was an error. It was a false identification. And there has to be a recovery of the true soul and its relationship with these instruments. And so the first step, which is taken up by the traditional approach, is to stand back from the body with what he describes as a negative method, which is to say, I am not body, to contradict and the false idea, and to concentrate by renunciation of the attachment of the soul to the physical, to concentrate on the knowledge and get rid of the body sense. So there is a double movement of concentration on the idea, greater idea, and renunciation of the lesser identification, which again we repeat on renunciation of the vital movements and desires, concentrating on this knowledge that I am not life, and then again the thing repeated with the mind. This is a negative method, Sri Aurobindo says, because the concentration is on the idea that I am not this, I am not that, and I am not the other. But still you're concentrating on something, renouncing the false identification. This merges smoothly with what he has described as the positive method, which is to concentrate the thought on the Brahman and shut out all other ideas, allow all else to cease, including the physical play, the vital movements, and the mental activities, they all fall into rest. We remain concentrated on the idea of Brahman. There is a renunciation of these things which distract or which are aspects or limitations or partial expressions, and we thus move in a positive concentration. Now you see how the negative method and the positive method are not really contradictory. One merges smoothly into the other, and even in the practice of the negative method, the positive method can easily enter. As you say, I am not body, I am Brahman. I am not life, I am Brahman. I am not mind, I am Brahman. And so the not body, which was a negative focus, can merge into the positive focus of Brahman. Now all of this is a very practical step leading us to some kind of immersion into an absolute experience, a gradual quieting cessation of the things of the world and the forms of these false identifications. But after all this, he says, self-centered and exclusively inner discipline, you open your eyes and the world is still there. The universe is there as a truth in God, even though the individual soul may have shut its eyes to it. And at the same time, the self is there in the universe, really and not falsely, supporting all that we have rejected, immanent in everything, embracing the universe. So what do we do with this eternal self and this persistent universe? And so the traditional method has a solution for this, which also we will accept as a useful experience, though we will not stop with that. And the solution of the ascetic path of knowledge is to regard this immanent self as in the image of an ether, something which fills, which supports, but itself is immaterial. You see here in the very starting position, we have chosen to limit our concept of the self by defining it as an unsubstantial supporting presence. And all the forms are only name form of the movement of energy, which energy itself resolves into the silence of the immanent self. And concentrating on the knowledge that there is only this silent, immutable ether behind supporting, rejecting at the same time all phenomenon and appearance, we withdraw into the silence. So again, there is a concentration on the silent self. There is a renunciation of phenomena, of appearance, of name and form. And as a result of this continued concentration, the whole world appears illusory, unreal. And only the silence of the self remains as the reality, and we are justified in withdrawing the individual consciousness, the individual self, into the absolute. And this is a very useful experience which also we will work upon. But after this, Sri Aurobindo says, something still remains. He says, still the self goes on with its imperishable aspect of immanence, its immutable aspect of divine envelopment, its endless trick of becoming each thing and all things. Our detection of the cheat and our withdrawal does not seem to affect one tittle of the universe. Now, while we may see the self, we may see the universe as unreal, illusory, the illusion is still going on, and the self is still supporting that illusion. So something obviously has been missed out. And so Sri Aurobindo says either there is something, some invincible reality at work, which our knowledge has not yet completely recognized, And so we need to work on this to find what is the completing knowledge. And then he says, we may see that it was our knowledge which was incomplete, and not that the Lord of the universe is a cheat and the universe is an illusion. So this is the key transition where we begin to break out to a different approach. And the difference is what is now placed before us, which we read briefly last time. And then he develops that idea and describes the nature of the experience that we have to finally recover, in which all these steps are useful steps. All these experiences are accepted as facets or aspects of a larger experience, but a correction will be made which will change the whole balance. The universe will no more be an illusory form, it will be a manifestation of the self. But in order to get to this complete knowledge, the complete realization, we may still use this path which has brought us up to here. But he now adds 2 layers of concentration which will correct the experience and complete it. So first he says, therefore we must concentrate again. So remember, we have earlier done several concentrations to separate from the body, separate from life, separate from mind, or turn to Brahman. Then we have dwelt on the self universe as an concentrating on that knowledge of an ether supporting the phenomenon and appearance, and allowed all the appearance of the universe to lapse into an unreality. So after all these concentrations, he says, therefore we must concentrate again and see and realize all this, and realize also this which persists so sovereignly, and must know the self as no other than the Supreme Soul, which is the Lord of nature, the upholder of cosmic existence, by whose sanction it proceeds, whose will compels its multitudinous actions and determines its perpetual cycles. So now you see the concentration turns direction. This self which is immanent in the universe and supporting all its now illusory forms and movements, this self we now see not merely as a silence, etheric silence supporting, but we see this self as no other than the Supreme Soul, which is Lord of nature. So here was this play of nature which now appears to be illusory, supported by the silent self, but the silent self is Lord of the nature, not only as Lord of nature, but upholder of the whole cosmic existence. That's how everything could continue, because it upheld it. But still one step deeper, it is that self, that Lord of existence and upholder, whose will compels all the actions of nature. So it is this, what we started with as a concept of an ethereal presence supporting, as an ethereal presence behind, we see it not only Lord, not only supporter, but the one who wills all this movement. Now at this point you see the whole picture begins to change. No more the universe is illusory, no more it fades into the supporting silence. We see it as form and expression of that consciousness which was supporting. It is no more seen falsely. So he says, okay, so first, this is the first step of the correction. And after that he adds one more step. And we must yet concentrate once again. So first concentration of the correction has been to see the self. And we saw last time 3 steps. It is Lord of nature, upholding, as well as willing and initiating everything. And we can do this in a form also, as all of the earlier steps of concentration are difficult to do in a dynamic state because they all involve a stepping back and a withdrawal into silence. And when you concentrate thus and try to enter a movement, if you try to do it in your activities of the day, it's difficult at first. So it's easier to be in a state of silence, eyes closed, you disengage, separate, withdraw, and so on. But afterwards, when you start this corrective movement, then you can actually enter the experience of the world. You can be in activity in the day with eyes open, looking at everything. And this perception which you had of a silent self supporting everything from behind, now you see it as the supporter, the Lord, the supporter and initiator of all the movements, including what's happening inside you, in your mind, in your life energies, and even in your body, which are part of the universal mind, universal life energies, and universal matter. And so you can let the movements of life continue while your consciousness still stays free in the midst of these movements. But one more correction is required, which will complete the experience. And so he says, we must yet concentrate once again. And what we do now, see and realize and must know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all. At once Purusha and Prakriti, and so able both to express himself in all these forms of things and to be all these formations. Otherwise, we have excluded from the self. Otherwise, we have excluded what the self does not exclude and made a willful choice in our knowledge. So this is the last correction. Notice, just before this correction, we had the experience of we, the free consciousness, and this whole movement of nature, which is supported by the self, initiated by the self, our own mind, life, body, a part of this movement, but still we, the consciousness, standing back, perhaps even immersed in the stillness and silence, while all this mind, life, body, and world and universe is an activity of movement, of play, initiated by the self. But there's still a schism, a gap. This silence supporting and this play expressing. The silence initiates the play, but it is still separate from the play. It supports the play, it is still separate from the play. It is Lord of the play, but it is still separate from the play. And so there is a transitional experience where we feel my consciousness, myself, is one with the divine self, leaning back on something which transcends everything. And my mind, life, body, nature is one with universal mind, life, body, nature. I am myself in two stations, consciousness, nature. Part of totality of consciousness and totality of nature. And this last step is merging these two. But they are not merged because in phenomenon, in experience, they are two separate things. They don't one merge into the other. Rather, we recognize the one divine, the one existence, who is both soul of all and nature of all. So there's as if a station of consciousness higher, of which these two are special statuses. There is a sense of rising above these two, and a consciousness in which one is simultaneously both. They are both aspects of myself. And so we reread this text, and we must concentrate once again and see and realize and must know the self as the one existence who is both the soul of all and the nature of all, at once Purusha and Prakriti. In the way we enter this experience, Sri Aurobindo uses 3 words. We must yet concentrate once again and see and realize and must know self as the one existence. See, realize, know. So in the way the concentration begins with a seeing. Because you are in your consciousness standing back, separate, watching all this. And you begin to turn your awareness in a seeing to this one existence, which is at the same time the soul, self, and nature. And there is a seeing consciousness at first. And it is that seeing which one begins to imprint on all things in the world. And then, as you continue to immerse in it, the seeing becomes, and through a joining of consciousness, a realize. You realize that I am this and that, or one consciousness which is this and that. And the last, know. And here there is an intimacy in which we merge into that. In the initial realization, there may still be a realization of one consciousness who is both, but I am only approaching it, or am a part of it. And then when there is a merging into it, you have the finality, which is knowing the self as the one existence who is both soul of all and nature of all. At once Purusha and Prakriti, and so able both to express himself in all these forms of things and to be all these formations. So he is inside each form, and he is also the formation everywhere in all things. And so there is a merging of these two, soul and nature, into a single existence which has both these statuses. This may be had first in a large level, and then later it moves into the details, or it may begin with seeing or feeling things in details, and a merging taking place which gradually builds up to join into the full. Or it may begin with this double experience which we have in ourselves very subjectively, where it begins to join, and then from here it ripples out into the fullness in all forms and into the totality universal. Any of these are starting points, entry points for the experience of the joining of these two, merging into one existence. This is the status that Sri Aurobindo points to as the highest realization that we must learn to live in. All the other concentrations which brought us to this are steps towards this. When we live in this realization, or when we even seek to enter this realization, we may use all these steps to get to it, or having used them for a while, we may discard all these steps and directly concentrate on a single concentration of this. Now, it is a little more difficult to do it this way, but it's possible. And it was this which Sri Aurobindo described in the previous chapter, as the chapter before the previous, as the single concentration on which we must meditate. It leads to this, directly to this experience. Initially it's a little more difficult because these distinctions are not yet clear to our own experience. And so it is useful to have passed through these steps of the concentration. Once the distinctions are clear, the unification of all these also becomes more easy, more complete. And this is the reason why in the evolution of human spirituality, all these steps of the ascetic path were taken up one by one, so that each of these can be developed into their fullness, each of these can be established as a realization now accessible to all humanity. And this last two corrective steps can be seen as the completion of what the ascetic path initially brought us to. And I keep reminding us of this, that we have all been through the ascetic path in earlier lives across the centuries. And the work done is not lost, it is there in us somewhere. Otherwise we would not be here. These two concentrations which Sri Aurobindo adds on top are completing the work which was done in earlier lives, but are also establishing the fullness of the integral experience in us. And so when we dwell on this concentration, it is possible in some part of us to move directly to this unified integral experience, but it is helpful to use the steps in between also. Now, what does this unified experience mean truly? What does it feel like in practice? How does it relate to the earlier experiences that we had, which also had their own way of unifying all these different levels of experience? So Sri Aurobindo now leads us through 2 paragraphs to a description of this. The first paragraph that we now take, he describes how in the ascetic tradition the oneness of the divine was organized in many levels. In a way, the oneness of the divine consciousness was divided in many stations, in many states. And Sri Aurobindo brings us to an experience where all these artificial distinctions are joined, healed and unified in a single. And so in this way he takes us to a first glimpse of this integral experience. He uses here the vocabulary which belongs to the old ascetic path of knowledge, and this vocabulary he has repeated in Savitri equally, that he takes trouble to repeat these keywords in a text as Savitri, and these are Sanskrit terms, shows us how important they are. And although right now Sri Aurobindo is almost dismissing this artificial division, we must recognize the value that it has had to bring us to this point where we can accept now a final unification. And so these words and these ideas are extremely important. He says, the old ascetic path of knowledge admitted the unity of things and the concentration on all these aspects of the one existence. But it made a distinction and a hierarchy. So it accepted, in theory, yes, it is one divine. But we must accept, because that is our experience, that the divine here is like this, there is like that, there is like that, and then there is the absolute. So these are the 4 gradations, degrees, or facets, or aspects of the Brahman in the manifestation. And this is how they made this distinction and a hierarchy. And in making a hierarchy, it's obvious, if the absolute is above, then all these are inferior in relation to the absolute. Therefore, all these we recognize are Brahman, but we must abandon or merge into the absolute. And so this is the logic which was the old ascetic path. And Sri Aurobindo describes it in this way, in summary. The self that becomes all these forms of things is the Virat, or universal soul. It is still self, but it is the aspect of self which has taken on all these forms and the play of all these forms. The word Virat in Sanskrit means massive, vast. And the word itself describes it as the universal self, universal soul, capital S. But above this, there is a station where the self is not yet in becoming of forms, not yet in rigidification of forms and divisions and distinctions of forms and names. So there, the self that creates all these forms is Hiranya Garbha, the luminous or creatively perceptive soul. So there is a station from where the self turns to create these rigid forms, at which point it still has the sense of the form of their distinctions, but not yet their rigidification, and it is more creative in its awareness. And so the luminous or creatively perceptive, what it sees, it turns to create. There is a station above where it sees without needing to create. But here, whatever it sees is the seeing that's turning to creation. And this is Hiranya Garbha. It is also self. And the name in Sanskrit means golden womb. Hiranya, golden, Garbha, womb. So it is the concentration of the self as a light, golden, creative, seeing, and because it is creative at a level where the formation is beginning to take place, therefore womb. The womb is where something not yet formed, something potential, begins to take form and is released into permanence of independent formation. While in the womb it is not yet permanent, it is not yet independent, it is formed by the consciousness out of itself. And only when the formation is completed, it is released from the womb and becomes separate and can stay on its own permanently. But this passage is what this domain or this status of the self represents. The luminous or creatively perceptive soul from which the forms of things are then released into Virat. And so, Hiranya Garbha, golden womb. This, for our understanding, includes all of the subtle worlds. In the subtle worlds of the inner vital, inner mental domains, form, yes, exists as idea of form, energy of form, but from there it is only when it concretizes into matter that it has permanence of form, of course not permanence in that sense, but objectification of form and permanence in the objectivity. That we can say this flower is flower for all of us. In the vital and mental world, the subjectivity of the experience is much stronger. Each one of us can see and experience this slightly differently, depending on what it means for us. And that is why those domains are so fluid. And in our own mental and vital experience, an object can have different values, different meaning. And that's the character of these domains. Form has not yet become distinct and fixed. But it is there as energy and as idea of form. And then above this is where all potential, all possibilities, even what is not released into manifestation is held. The self that contains all these things involved in it is Prajna, the conscious cause, capital C, or originally determining soul, capital S. So the cause of all this, from where the whole movement, the choice to manifest certain things which become the things, the cause is here, and it is here that the original determination is made of what can be. And here he describes as the self that contains all these things involved in it. In other words, all the possibilities are in it but not given turn to manifestation and to formation. So these three levels Sri Aurobindo has in another text described in our subjective experience as the experience of a writer. I am going to write a novel. At this point, my mind turns to the possibilities. And immediately I am aware in my consciousness. I don't even have to create. It is all there. I am aware of all the different kinds of characters I can create, all the different kinds of novels I can write, different themes I can play with. It can be a mystery novel, it can be a romantic novel, it can be drama, it can be historical, it can be symbolic. And even if I have a particular storyline, I could cast it into any of these molds, but I have an infinite possibility of storylines. I don't even need to stop and think about them. They are all there. But potential. And what is meant by potential is it is already there without effort to create. And at this point, on the base of this potential, my mind turns to a specific direction. I'm going to write a historical mystery with a tinge of romance and an element of symbolism. And it will draw upon these particular characters and represent them in this particular way. And still now, the specific form of the story is not there, only the mood of the story is expressed. But my mind needed to actually make a choice to draw this forward, as out of this infinity of possibilities, which I didn't have to make effort even to know. The effort begins when there is a selection, a narrowing to bring forward. And so from the prajna, where everything is present, I have moved gradually to the hiranya garbha status, where these forms are now being put in relation to each other, a story experience is held, and then out of that it takes a practical, limited, narrowed expression into Virat as I put my storyline. These characters, this is how they will put in sequence, this is how they will play, this is how they interact, these are the words they will speak, the actions they will do. And that's the movement from Hiranyagarbha into Virat. And when finally it is written out in words, it is fixed into the Virat status. But here in the Hiranyagarbha status, I can mix and rearrange easily. For example, in the storyline, there is this central character, there is an opposing character, but the central character, let's say, has parents, he has children, he has relatives, he has friends and enemies, and it's all there already. Which of these will I highlight and how? Is the movement of the creativity here. He has, for example, a childhood. But in the way I will articulate the story, I will not focus on the childhood at all. And yet it is there, I can't ignore it. It has been one of the formative influences. So somewhere in the middle of the story, there is a flashback. As he faces his crisis in life, he recalls an incident in childhood when he fell and his parents came and said, "Do you know why we fall? In order to stand up once again." And suddenly this becomes a surge of strength and support, and he stands up. Momentarily we touch the formative phase, which in my consciousness is all there, and I can bring into it as much rich detail as I want, but I choose now to just focus on this much. And the whole arranging, placing, giving priority, putting in sequence, linearizing what is parallel and simultaneous is taking place in the creative process of the Hiranyagarbha. And as it gets more and more concretized and fixed, it moves into the Virat, where now finally it gets written out. Repeatedly though, as I am writing, I step back into the Hiranyagarbha status, review, do I need to do this? How much do I want to hold in the balance? And push forward to amplify certain details. And all of this is supported by the prajna, in which all the possibilities that I could articulate are already present effortlessly. And so this status he describes as the self that contains all these things involved. Nothing has been given form yet. Involved is prajna, the conscious cause or original determining soul. But beyond all this, beyond all these, is the Absolute who permits all this unreality, but has no dealings with it. So I, as the creator, the writer, I stop my writing process. I say, enough for today. I close the papers, set aside my pen, shut down the computer, walk out. I am nothing to do with this novel. None of these creatures are I am me. Separate from all these creations which could be fantasies of my mind. They have no other reality. They are all unrealities, fantasies of my creation. I walk away. I am me. And this would be the fourth status, the Absolute, who permits all this unreality, but who is beyond has no dealings with it, except when he chooses to. When he chooses to, then through these three steps, three stages, there is the manifestation. But the truth of Absolute is, I have nothing to do with all this. I am beyond all this. Into that, we must withdraw and have no further dealings with the universe, since knowledge means the final knowledge. Now, this is the logic of the old ascetic path. Knowledge means the final knowledge, and therefore these lesser realizations must fall away from us or be lost in that. So either they fall away and they become non-existent, I have walked away from my writings, my creativities, or they merge into it. All my creativities are absorbed and I stand back free as one. Now if you see, and we've used this analogy, and the analogy is powerful. If you see the spiritual experience of withdrawal, of merging into that, or separating and stepping away into that, reflects in our relationship with things in life. And in this analogy you see very clearly, what does the writer do? He says, I am not these illusory creations. I choose to withdraw them, absorb them into myself, into my silence. I am simply. And what does a man who seeks this end up with in life? No action, no manifestation. Life itself becomes irrelevant. He withdraws into his silence. He simply is in the Absolute, and that's it. So you can see why the end point of the ascetic path and its logic is having nothing to do with the universe, but the person, the consciousness itself then withdraws, and everything ends in what is seen as the final knowledge against which all these relative knowledge have to fade out. Sri Aurobindo now changes this whole perspective. He does not deny the descriptions of these statuses. You can see how true it is already. He does not deny their value. You can see how useful they are also for our internal mind, which have a value for certain purposes but no ultimate value. Why is it no ultimate value? Think about it like this. When you sit down as the creative writer, does it matter for you whether you are this person who is separate from the creations, whether you have this status where all the potentialities exist, whether you have moved into the creative phase of formation, or whether you are in the finalization of the forms? Does it make any difference to know these separate statuses within yourself? You sit down and you flow into manifestation. When you come to rest, the manifestation itself, the activity of manifestation rests, the potential is still present, and it flows once again. And there are rhythms of flowing and resting and flowing and resting, but I am me. Even when I am standing back, even when I am flowing in, even when I am between these three gradations and distinctions, which may seem inferior from a certain perspective, but are all the time me, entirely and simultaneously. In the act of writing with my hand, where I am giving the final form with pen or a typewriter or computer, I don't cease to be the creative person who is still formulating and casting. I don't cease to have the status of all the potential. I don't cease to stand above in an absolute freedom from these forms. I am at the same time all this in one continuity of consciousness. And so the separations we made have no practical value. No ultimate value, sorry. They have a practical value but no ultimate value. And even the practical distinctions for certain purposes. Now, as a writer, when I am in training, In the training school, they will tell me, okay, sit down. Write down all the characters of your story. Let's develop what are the specific features of each character. So the hero has one weakness. The anti-hero has these characteristics. The friend of the hero has these, and we develop the character form. And then as we articulate the drama, the play, the storyline, we draw upon those references of giving form to each character. We make sure that throughout the novel, that particular character behaves in that particular way. And there's an interplay of these. We have thought about what is the point of tension. So they ask you to sit down and say, what will be your opening? What will be the point of tension? What will be the resolution? How will you represent them? In what proportion? Now all of these are exercises useful for giving form to the play. But ultimately, they have no ultimate value. Because I could just as well sit down and pour through without bothering with all these details, because it's already there. But for training, it is useful to go through these steps, to make these distinctions, and so on. So he says, evidently from our point of view meaning from the integral perspective, from our point of view, these are practical distinctions made by the mind, which have a value for certain purposes but no ultimate value. And it is the mind who is trying to look at all these experiences and give specific terms and distinctions. But if you notice, even while we were discussing the three stations of Virat, Hiranyagarbha and Prajna, you notice there was continuity between the three. All this potential, something draws out, moves into relation, adjustment, play, proportion, and turns into form and specific fixity. Nowhere can you stop and say, here this stops and the other begins. There is a continuity. Mind standing back tries to create these distinct characteristics. And so, traditionally they speak of Brahman having four statuses. But our view, Sri Aurobindo says, our view of the world insists on unity. The universal self is not different from the perceptive and creative, nor the perceptive from the causal, nor the causal from the absolute. But it is one self-being which has become all becomings, and which is not any other than the Lord who manifests himself as all these individual existences, nor the Lord any other than the sole existing Brahman, who verily is all this that we can see, sense, live or mentalize. That self, Lord, Brahman, we would know, that we may realize our unity with it and with all that it manifests, and in that unity we would live. This is the direction of the experience we have to establish. For we demand of knowledge that it shall unite. A very important principle that Aurobindo is putting forward. We demand of knowledge that it shall unite. The knowledge that divides must always be a partial knowing, good for certain practical purposes. The knowledge that unites is the knowledge. Now, in just 3 sentences, Sri Aurobindo has literally summarized the central message of the Isha Upanishad. You will recall in the Isha Upanishad there are 2 verses which discuss the knowledge of multiplicity and knowledge of unity. The avidya and the vidya. And of course the knowledge of unity is the superior knowledge. And so the knowledge of multiplicity must know itself in relation to the knowledge of unity. So knowledge that divides, he says, must be a partial knowing, good for practical purposes. Avidya is the domain where the divided knowledge allows you to master the practical domain of life. But After that, all must be reunited into the knowledge of Vidya. And it is in that knowledge, that is, he says, the knowledge. And so we demand of knowledge that it shall unite. And so we have to complete the path of integral knowledge by unification of all these stations. And there he discusses these three words, self, Lord, Brahman. He discusses how it is one single movement, which is all this. And he quotes from the Isha Upanishad when he says, one self-being which has become all becomings. Kavir, Manishi, Paribhu, Swayambhu, the self-existent, who is taking these three stations of Kavi, seeing, Manishi, mentalizing, Paribhu, becoming in form. But it is always Swayambhu, the self-being who moves to manifestation. This is one verse. And then there is the other verse, which is, I have the text here. The other verse where he says, he, 7th verse 7, he in whom it is the self-being which has become all existences that are becomings. For he has the perfect knowledge. How shall he be deluded? Whence shall he have grief who sees everywhere oneness? So he in whom it is the self-being which has become all existences that are becomings. So he is actually quoting from the Isha even as he summarizes that whole approach. So we have quickly read through and now we go into the details of what this description leads us to, and then what it ends in. What is the nature of that complete experience we will look at finally. So, our view of the world insists on unity. The universal self is not different from the perceptive and creative. Since the self that is becoming the form is also the same self who was moving to cast into form. Equally, that same self moving to cast into form is nor the causal nor the perceptive from the causal. It was always the one who was holding all the causes and then within himself moving to form and then within himself becoming form. But it is one self. Nor the causal from the absolute. That self is at the same time absolute, even as it includes in its absoluteness all these relativities. And so now our concept of self has just been modified. It is the self which became the form, which is the self who held the formations before the form emerged, which is also the self who holds all the potentialities of form, which is also the self who stands back from all limitation in form in absoluteness, holding all relativities in itself potentially, or releasing all these relativities from its absoluteness to play in relative manifestation. But the self itself never changes. It is one self throughout. Now you see already the station, the consciousness is like this. It holds an absolute, but the absolute is not blank. It is full of rich, infinite potential. It dwells on that infinite potential, puts them in relation to each other, and moves them into form and expression of form. But it is still the same self throughout. One consciousness, absolute, turning to know its relativities, play with its relativities, articulate its relativities, but always remaining always absolute in its play of relativities. Infinite potential, infinite quality, Ananta Guda, standing beyond qualities and yet including all qualities and then moving into expression of qualities and enjoying the play of all qualities and all relativities inside them at the same time. But one consciousness throughout, one being, one existence. So, but it is self-being which has become all becomings. And this idea is in the Isha Upanishad summarized in one word, Swayambhu. Swayam is self or of oneself, by myself. Bhu, existing, becoming. So Swayambhu is self-being, translated, or self-being. At the same time, Bhu includes both ideas. So self-being which has become all becomings. And so Swayambhu, in a single formulation, in a single word, contains the full idea of being, becoming, and all by oneself, always self. Nothing changing while still becoming all things. So it is one self-being which has become all becomings. In the Isha text, the phrase he is translated as the seer, the thinker, the one who becomes everywhere, the self-existent, has ordered objects perfectly according to their nature from years sempiternal. So the seer, thinker, one who becomes everywhere. These are the three stations. But at the same time, it is the self-existent, Swayambhu. And this one self, and remember, self is the one who is supporting, who is Lord, and this one self, which is not any other than the Lord who manifests himself as all these individual existence. So from self we have come to Lord, because he is the master who initiates to express. Not merely the self who supports, he is also the initiator, and as in the Isha Upanishad it is highlighted, the enjoyer. So he supports with equality, unmoved, placing the foundation of permanence, but at the same time he is the one who is initiating, and in the initiation and in the expression of form, entering the form and enjoying the form from inside and from outside. The enjoyment is complete. The creator, I, the writer of my play, enjoy the fullness of the play as one being that I give birth to. But at the same time, I enjoy the play of identification with each of the characters and each of the situations. So as the writer, I really enjoyed expressing this character who is always going through difficulties, internal conflicts. I enjoyed expressing myself as this character who is always free, who is always cheerful, who is always playing unaffected as if, and flows with every situation. And each of the individual characters and situations, I am fully inside, entirely as me, in each of them. They are me. And at the same time, I am fully expressing myself in the totality of the play and enjoying the whole. And so the enjoyment is complete from outside, from inside, and down to each individual form. And above all, I enjoy the fact that although I have created such a beautiful thing, I am free to create innumerable, infinite, and infinitely greater compositions, or none of them. That enjoyment also is simultaneous. So, the self, which is not any other than the Lord who manifests himself as all these individual existences, nor the Lord any other than the sole existing Brahman. So even as Lord, as I am master and player and enjoyer, I am at the same time the one who walks away, who includes all the possible plays that I could ever write. So there is, when speaking of Brahman, this station where I am absolute, but my absoluteness includes all my relativities and possibilities. So he completes the circle, the sole existing Brahman, who verily is all this that we can see, sense, live, or mentalize. Although one, he is all this which we are experiencing inside the play, inside the manifestation, in individuality of form, through the limitation of the five senses, this also is Brahman, who is at the same time the one Brahman. So the whole cycle is complete. It started with the forms and the self supporting the forms, and then the Lord who became all the forms, and then the Brahman who is in oneness, but who is at the same time all the infinity of the forms. I, the writer of the play, after completing my play, I turn away from it, enjoy myself in my oneness and my freedom, and then in my freedom I turn in myself and experience all the infinite plays that I have yet to write, and enjoy the possibility of their writing, and then move to manifesting them one by one or simultaneously. And so you will reread again, and you see how he is capturing an experience where the distinctions are there, but he is flowing through those distinctions and merging them into something which is a unity. Our view of the world, I'm rereading, our view of the world insists on unity. The universal self is not different from the perceptive and creative, nor the perceptive from the causal, nor the causal from the absolute. But it is one self-being which has become all becomings, and which is not any other than the Lord who manifests himself as all these individual existences, nor different from, nor the Lord any other than the sole existing Brahman, who verily is all this that we can see, sense, live or mentalize. That self, Lord, Brahman, we would know, that we may realize our unity with it and with all that it manifests, and in that unity we would live. So this is the united, synthetic experience which the approach of the integral knowledge aims towards. The self, Lord, Brahman, we would know, that we may realize our unity with it and with all that it manifests, and in that unity we would live. So there is one consciousness. In our unity with it is the soul experience identifying, but also including all that it manifests, including our mind, life, body. And that also is the Lord. And in that unity we would live. And you see how in this consciousness, our mind, life, body is not other than our consciousness which is separate from them. They're all expressions of that. And everything in the universe, beginning with our subjective internal experience all the way into the objectivity of it all, is one consciousness, Lord, Brahman, Self. And in that we are immersed in the oneness of it all. And all the multiplicities which we may experience practically in gradations, distinctions, are all Him. And we are dwelling on Him who is all these. We are not dwelling on the distinctions between them. We are playing with those distinctions, but we see Him even in their play. And so in that unity we would live. The form in which this experience is held is that the whole universe is one Lord, one existence, at the same time transcending beyond all the forms into an absolute, and at the same time expressing into all these gradations and relativities of the play. He is equally in all things, in absolute and in relative play, as in us. And so the distinction also between His consciousness, His freedom, and His manifesting power and nature, that distinction also is not there. He is in everything equally. He is inside the forms of nature as an absolute, seated in the relativity. He presides over the whole play of the relativities in His absolute consciousness, and there is a complete interpenetration of all these facets of the experience in a single unity of the Lord. the Brahman, who is also the Self. The Self, Lord, Brahman, we would know, that we may realize our unity with it and with all that it manifests, and in that unity we would live. The importance he gives, for we demand of knowledge that it shall unite. We complete this paragraph now, and the next paragraph takes this experience in its practical form in the life and in relation to all the previous articulations, philosophies, religious experiences, and puts them in context. Therefore, our integral yoga will take up these various disciplines and concentrations, but harmonize and, if possible, fuse them by a synthesis which removes their mutual exclusions. And that will be the theme for the next few chapters. How these different concentrations and disciplines will be harmonized and fused into a single synthesis, so that they are no more seen as exclusive. Not realizing the Lord and the All only to reject them for silent self or unknowable absolute, as would an exclusively transcendental, nor living for the Lord alone or in the Lord alone, as would an exclusively theistic or an exclusively pantheistic yoga. The seeker of integral knowledge will limit himself neither in his thought, nor in his practice, nor in his realization by any religious creed or philosophical dogma. It's a long sentence, but it puts everything together. He will seek the truth of existence in its completeness. So, in the way he has articulated the limitations, we will find all the major approaches brought together. So first he says, not realizing the Lord and the All only to reject them for silent self or unknowable absolute, as would an exclusively transcendental discipline, practice, yoga. So the exclusively transcendental has already decided that I am going to enter only into the transcendental exclusively. Therefore, everything that is required for that I will accept in relation to that goal. So that's why you will see even the way the steps are taken. It starts by assuming that you will get only to that, and all the rest, therefore, you must find ways to reject. So he says, you realize the Lord and the All only to reject them for silent self. And there is a choice made of the rejection. This is one broad approach. And the other broad approach is, nor living for the Lord alone or in the All alone, as would an exclusively theistic or an exclusively pantheistic yoga. So if we took an exclusively theistic poise that says the divine is only this one being, we do not have the idea of a transcendence. We have only the being who is always in manifestation. And this would be the approach of most religions. In the religious teachings, the starting point is that there is one creator, there is one divine, there is one something, someone, by whatever name or form you give to it. And then also there is the universe, and we may have a relationship between him and the universe. Even if you go so far as to say it is he who manifests as universe, there is something. There is not the idea of a transcendence into something beyond. And so there is an exclusion in the transcendence, cutting off the universe, or in the theistic, there is the cutting off of the transcendence. And you're stuck in the form and in the manifestation. So even your idea of divine has to be limited to a form. And if you reduce him to a human form, then of course we have a very big problem. Otherwise you give him some kind of a formless quality. He is God, he is love, he is knowledge, he is power, he is all love, he is all these things, but you've still missed out the transcendence which is beyond. So the theistic approach would have this idea of Lord for whom alone you exist and live, because there's nothing else which is more important, or in the pantheistic, where you see the various forms of the divine and the multiplicity of the divinities. There is this idea of living in the all, living in the whole, in the forms, in the manifestations and their interplay. But even these, while being in the all, they capture a facet, an aspect. They miss out something greater. And that's why you will see in the conflict of religions, these two broad categories always fight one against the other. Between themselves, they find some kind of alliance. So in the Indian context, we will see a life rejecting, universe denying Vedantic approach and the Buddhist practices and approach coming very close together. Sri Aurobindo even observes that Shankaracharya could remove Buddhism from India because he himself became half a Buddhist. Half because the goal was still the same, to get out into the absolute. The other half, which was different, was the affirmation that the absolute is not emptiness but fullness, seen in a different way. But the goal was still the same, and so there was a common alliance. One defeated the other, but they had common results. On the other side, you have the religions, which have all these different forms being given to God. And then another religion comes which denies all these forms and aims back at the absolute. So we see this sharply taking place in the Middle East, in the emergence of Islam, which denied all relativities and inferior deities for absolute. But eventually even it had to accept the absolute in terms of its names. So God has 100 names or 1,000 names, depending on how one approaches it. 100 names known to humans, 1,000 names known to the angels. In other words, you need a higher consciousness to know those higher aspects. But it sought to kill, to destroy form, to crush anything which had form in favor of an absolute transcendence. But again, in practice, it needed a focal point. And the focal point became what was a pre-Islamic temple, with idols broken, but only the rock which is held as symbol of the absolute, because it comes from the sky. Eventually, though, there is still a focal point. I once had this peculiar situation of somebody who was working in a project, who came to me and said, "Oh, no, I have a question." He was a Muslim. He said, "I have a question." And he had been provoked to ask this, obviously. He said, "Why is it all the religions except God is beyond form? And yet, in Hinduism, you have all these forms." So that he genuinely sought to know. So I explained to him that, human mind needs a focal point. So he said, "No, but it is beyond form." So finally I had to tell him, "But what do you do when you pray on Friday? You orient yourself to the Makkah, isn't it?" "Yes, but we have a blank wall." But I said, "Your mind is on the Makkah. Your blank wall is only for your immediate appearance. Where is your mind? It is on that form, that location, that center." Why? Because you have to put your mind somewhere. And in the beginning, you cannot put your mind on something which is abstract without form. Even if you try to conceive of an abstract without form, you will give to it a form, like an etheric expanse. So eventually you have to have something to hold on to begin with. Later you may move into the formless. So he got very upset. Then I realized that he was just doing it to provoke. He had been asked by whoever it was to ask these questions to provoke people. But he was upset because he could not answer the question of why he had to put his mind on a form and on a location. But in practice, even when a religion has sought to aim at something absolute, in the practice it has always had to begin with something which was a direction towards the absolute, but in the domain of the relative, in the domain of the form. So in the practices of Buddhism and the life renouncing Vedantic practice, since the philosophy is more developed than, say, in the religious traditions, where it is only practices and rules you have to follow and laws that you have to obey, not much philosophy and explanation or understanding of why and how these things happen or what it is you're aiming at. Because both Buddhism and Shankarite Vedanta have a strong base of philosophy. You have at least an understanding of why you're doing this and where you're aiming at, even though you have practices which deal with form in order to transcend form. And you'll find these two are broad categories which finally enter in conflict. They approach, one aiming at a means or using means through religious forms towards something, another uses practices which are irreligious even to get to something. All of these have caught one aspect. So he says, the seeker of integral knowledge will limit himself neither in his thought, nor in his practice, nor in his realization by any religious creed or philosophical dogma. So he has used three terms here: the thought, the practice, and the realization. Each of these has to be integral, complete, and aiming at the unitive experience. So the thought is the first step where we have an understanding of what it is we are aiming at, a philosophical understanding, the things we are reading now, to get a sense of where we want to get to. The practice itself then has to represent and reflect the fullness of the thought. The approach itself has to be integral in the practice, and which will be the theme of the subsequent chapters. But as you approach, what you realize also should be complete, integral. So when Sri Aurobindo describes in one of the very early chapters in what way the integral yoga is integral, he merges these three things in integrality. First, our concept of what we are aiming at has to be integral. In other words, we will not accept with a partial perspective. We must be able to see all and know all in a right relation in the totality and in the unity. Then in the practice there is integrality, because all the parts of our being are taken up. All the principles of all the different systems and approaches are included around a uniting framework and principle. And then as we grow in the sadhana, in the yoga, in the experience, the realization of the divine also will be integral. We must know the divine in all its aspects, all its facets, in the way the divine knows himself in his completeness. And so there are three ways in which the integral yoga is integral. You will not find anywhere any formulation which is so thorough and so complete. Subsequently, we have seen in modern times, many people have caught the word integral because it matches the theme of the immediate focus of evolution. So there are people who have created their own integral yoga. But what they mean by that is mixing a little bit of karma yoga and bhakti, or doing hatha yoga asanas along with some devotionalism. And so they call it integral. Or there are now philosophical groups which have appropriated the word integral. And if you try on the internet to find any domain name with the word integral, they have bought it all. Integral anything, and they own it, and it is held by their institution. But you will see there the attempt is philosophical understanding, but not in the practice. The practice is not integral, nor the realization integral. They just try to fit together all the pieces somehow to put them in some context. But there is not the transcendence, there is not the breakthrough where something essential is seen, of which all these are facets. It stops short somewhere. There is nothing so far where it is so completely expressed in the full sense of what an integral yoga should be, can be. Must be. So he says, the seeker of the integral yoga, he says, he must seek the truth of existence in its completeness. Now the truth of existence, and so that includes everything, of the realization of the divine, of the approaches, of the understandings, of the expressions, of the manifestations, everything is included in that. He must seek the truth of existence in its completeness. So where do we place all the disciplines, all the traditions, and all the practices that we have looked at, which belong to the earlier approaches? The ancient disciplines he will not reject, for they rest upon eternal truths, but he will give them an orientation in conformity with his aim. So here comes a very important approach in Sri Aurobindo's articulation. All these disciplines, if you go behind the form of the discipline, you will see the deeper truths, and those truths are eternal. That's how these disciplines were formulated, from a perception of a truth. And as expressions and formulations of a truth, they have a great power. The problem is, each of these disciplines is based on a different perception of another partial truth. And in the form of it, it is oriented to a particular outcome and result. And so it is as if a truth is taken partially, and then it is given a specific direction, ignoring all other possibilities of direction. Now this we can understand after all the discussion we have been through. And so what Sri Aurobindo does is he goes to the essential truths, places that essential truths and the many truths in context of the one truth, one whole, which is the only complete truth. There is no other complete truth. There is one complete, of which all of these are aspects, facets. So we place those in relation, and then in the application of the truth, even within the form of the practice, we turn it in the direction of realizing the whole truth, rather than realizing one facet of it. So for example, a principle is rejection. Rejection, renunciation is a principle in order to attain to some transcendence. Now we could get this principle and apply it, as we have already seen in the previous few paragraphs. We could apply it in a very specific discipline and turn it to realize only an absolute in transcendence. Perfect. You could equally reorient it in order to liberate yourself from a limitation or an entanglement in some part of your nature. And then from that station of freedom, turn upon that part to transform it. The same principle, the same truth. But now you realize this truth is incomplete without its complementary truth, which is the truth of manifesting, of transforming, transmuting. Liberation is incomplete without transformation. And so there is the truth which liberates, there is the truth which transforms, and these two have to go hand in hand. So in the transforming truth, again, there are sub-facets. The discipline which we use, the concentration which is applied, and the way the concentration is directed. So in any method, Sri Aurobindo looks at the mind. Form is then given a fresh energy from the truth behind it, and then it is oriented towards the total realization, the integral realization and perfection. So he says, the ancient disciplines he will not reject, for they rest upon eternal truths, but he will give them an orientation in conformity with his aim. And the aim is the completeness in the truth of all existence to be realized in thought, in practice, and in the realization, the completeness, the integrality. This is the reason why in the synthesis of yoga you will find Sri Aurobindo again and again goes to essential principles behind all the techniques and methods. And because he goes to these, we can understand how and why these techniques work. What is the lever behind it? Knowing that, we are able to go to the essence from which the whole method and technique can be made enormously more powerful. When people focus on the form of the technique, they may miss the thing which makes it effective. And so the same technique applied perhaps 1,000 times may lead to a very small result. The technique of mantra, for example, if you understand the principle behind, it is not the speech sound you make. The principle behind is the repetition and the concentration in the repetition. The repetition in form and the consciousness behind concentrating through repetition to cut through to the thing itself of which the mantra represents, of which it is the form. And so you put your attention on the concentration on the thing you want to get to, and the form as the rhythm for the concentration to get to it. And then suddenly you realize the particular formulation is secondary. It is this focus of concentration and the thing to which you aim, which is amplifying it. And so even in the science of mantra, they say, when you do it with concentration on the meaning, a repetition 3 times is equal to mechanical repetition of 100 or 1,000 times. You get to this, and at some point you may even say, this particular mantra is not so important. I may use whatever mantra my heart or my mind spontaneously feels puts me in direct contact with the divine or with that which I seek to realize. So the word that emerges spontaneously, which for me represents most powerfully that, is my mantra. And as I turn to the divine, perhaps for me it is Mother. And that becomes the mantra. I do not need then to cast into form so many different things or draw upon a formulation which has been infused with energy by somebody else. It's just this. And it spontaneously flows from my heart and becomes my expression. So one can even recast the form of the practice to make it unique, distinctive to us personally. And this is the beauty of what Sri Aurobindo has done. He has freed us from the particular formulations of techniques and methods by going to their deeper animating principles and the spiritual truths on which they are based, and from there liberating and giving form and power to whatever the nature of the practice. And that's what we will see in the coming chapters, how all these things he will bring together to make for one all-inclusive, multifaceted, single practice. So this chapter completes with one more paragraph where he narrows down our focus. Yes, we have self, we have Lord, we have Brahman, we have all, many forms, and yet the method of the change is going to be by a change internally in our consciousness. Ultimately, we have to bring our attention to a realization within us. All external efforts also, even if you take up a practice of karma yoga, or even if it is a form of bhakti yoga which is turned to an external worship, it still aims at an internal focus of change. Through karma yoga, you're not trying to change the material that you're handling. You're trying to change your consciousness which is handling the material, right? Through bhakti yoga, you're not changing the form of the idol towards which your devotion is turning. You're trying to change your consciousness through the act of the devotion. So eventually he says, it is inside us that we have to realize that self, and not in others outside. But when this internal change is completed, and he leads once again to the fullness of the experience through this internal subjective effort, then we will realize that in all things, and then it will be complete. Our one individual experience will break the barrier of our individual separation and complete itself in the fullness of a realization that includes the whole universe. This description and the practical direction in which our energy is to move in our practice is articulated in this paragraph, which becomes then the precursor for the next few chapters we move into the practical form, and you will see the next chapter is titled The Release from the Subjection to the Body. The one after is Release from the Heart and the Mind. The one after, the release from the ego. And the one after that, the realization of the cosmic self. And after that, the modes of the self. You can see how it's summarizing all that we have discussed. What was discussed in summary is elaborated. And finally, the realization of Satchidananda. The whole path of what we have to do has already been placed before us in summary, reoriented in the context of an integral realization for an integral yoga. And with this one focus of what we have to do within ourselves, we will begin the whole practice of this yoga of integral knowledge. So this last paragraph we will take up next time. For now we can pause here and take up any questions or any comments. You see how this whole text could be taken up in a purely philosophical way. You could say, oh, this is how he differentiates the path. But the way we have taken it is from a more experiential way. What is the experience he is describing within that larger philosophical framework? And that's when the text has a greater value for us. Unfortunately, people have made the error of reading the synthesis of yoga more as a philosophical description of what is it we have to do. Ignoring, therefore, automatically the content of the experience of what it is we experience as we do this. And they neatly filter that part out and then only articulate the philosophy. And then, of course, you ask, but how do we do it? He has described exactly how to do it, and that's what we have been concentrating on. In the Life Divine, similarly, you'll find the philosophical formulation is first. He places all the ideas in right relation to each other, frees them from their narrowness, limitations, to open to a fullness and a completeness, and in passing describes how it changes the consciousness internally. There the emphasis is on the philosophical understanding, and the experiential content follows in the wake. Here the description is primarily of the experience, and the philosophical framework only sets the context for the experience. And so in reading we have to focus in a different way.
So the line where he says, but he will give them an orientation in conformity with his faith.
Mm-hmm.
So here, after reading this line, I was thinking that how the integral sadhana should give the orientation. So I think this has been discussed already.
No, it is a statement. So the question is, he will give them an orientation in conformity with his aim. So how is this orientation to be done? So if you see already the way he has been describing things, he has been reorienting us as we are reading. So we started with the idea, oh yes, there's a wrong identification with our mind, life, body. We have to recover our true self. How do we do that? Well, first we disengage. Then we stand back, but we have still to deal with this. And bit by bit, he has taken us through an experience. And then he says, but something is missing, and here's the correction. So he has led us through a reorientation already. Okay? But at the same time, he is giving us the big picture as we move to the finality, the completion of the experience. The big picture comes, and now we hold this big picture. Once we have this as the reference of our larger experience, anything we do, we will reorient towards that. So this statement has two dimensions to it. One is the reorientation, the way we have been led through. We reorient in this way towards an integral realization. But then it's also a second dimension, which is in everything you do, in all your practice, in all your thoughts, in all your activities of life, reorient the purpose to this. I'm eating food. I could say, oh, this is nature, this is prakriti, this is a compulsion of the biology. It's a requirement I have to pass through. I let it happen mechanically. I don't put any interest in it. That would have been the ascetic path. Or you can say, this food is a gift of God. I am grateful to you. I offer my thanks. That would be the religious path. Or you consecrate the food and you say, this food is offered to God that He may purify this consciousness. And when I eat, let this consecrated consciousness fill my body, energize my mind, so that I may serve the divine more and more. All of these different orientations are possible depending on what is your objective or your goal. But now we have this big picture that we want to be immersed in this integral realization. We want to live in the self-Lord Brahman experience, in the unity of Him. And now when I eat the food, I hold this as my reference. And I orient the act of eating to this experience. And now if you describe what it is like, the food is Brahman. I am Brahman. The act of eating is Brahman. And the whole thing is taking place in the manifestation of Brahman, in the unity. If you enter the experience, it has so many different facets at the same time. Depending on your mood or need at that moment, one of these may get highlighted, but they are all present at the same time. The bhakta in me is enjoying this whole thing. The jnani in me is enjoying this whole thing in a different way. And the karma yogi in me is enjoying it in a different way. And it's all happening at the same time in this totality of the experience which I hold. But I've turned my act of eating to include it in this experience, or in this direction of the experience. So everything in life will just undergo a slight shift, a slight turn, becoming a means and a support or an occasion to express. Does it make sense? Yes.
Like you were saying,
Yes.
that people take synthesis of yoga as a philosophy.
Yes.
While explaining Shirodino is already giving us the description. That
Exactly.
we should not be missing that point.
Right.
Read it with that perspective.
Yes,
That he is
yes.
also telling us how to do it.
Exactly.
Most of the time I come across this question, okay, Shirodino has told this, but how to do this?
Right.
Now I'll go back with that thought that now he's also describing how to do it.
Yes. Not only he is describing how to do, he is describing the experience when you do it or when you reach it. Even the experience is included. And that's why, as he describes, he leads you into the experience. But you have to read with that approach in order to be able to receive the full impact of it.
What is theistic and dependent?
So theistic is the religious approach, where there is God and there is a relationship with God. The problem is, the moment you conceive of a God, you have already a thing inside the universe. Or you put him outside the universe, but then you have a larger universe of which includes both him and this universe. So eventually you have things which you are dealing with. Pantheism is seeing God in many forms, either everywhere or in multiple forms of so many gods and their problems and their interactions, or the universe itself formed of their play. But in that case also, you have things and objects. They're all playing in the relativity of the universe. You have limited yourself from the aspect of the transcendence and the thing which is beyond all this play, even of God. So that's why Buddhism rejects God. Because the idea of God is itself a limitation in the relativity. And so it goes beyond. But you still have to give a name to it. So it names it emptiness. But the emptiness is still something you're relating to, right? So you can relate to it in different ways. You end up with all these complex problems of philosophy because in the very act of formulating, you're reducing it and bringing it to some limited idea. So finally, in all these philosophical approaches, they will say, therefore get to the experience. Till then you use the words, after that you abandon the words. The theistic is useful because it gives us most directly a reference that we are able to relate to, however limited. But eventually we must use that as a means to get to the beyond. The bhakti, for example, the bhakti yoga would be very difficult if your relationship is with a God who is absolute, transcendent, formless, impersonal. So you have to have a person and a relationship of your heart's love flowing to the person. And the moment you have a person, you have a form. The moment you have a form, you have representation of form and many representations of the form. So in the Vaishnavite tradition of bhakti, you will have Sri Krishna as the child. So in certain bhakti lineages, every day they will, in the morning, wake up the child from his little crib, bathe him, dress him, feed him. And then every evening they will put him to sleep. But it is the Lord, it is not your own personal human baby. So there's a different dimension to it. Or it may take the relationship of the beloved. He is your lover. Or he is your friend. Or he is your guru and guide. But all of these are relationships which are basically human relationships that we have turned to the divine. And they are so convenient because of that. Now I can enter in relation as I am with all my current capacities, humanly. But because I am connecting it to one who is divine, through that my human capacity itself gets purified and raised into something deeper and truer.
How is religion different from spirituality? It can use the religious people are devotional, they have devotion. Why do we undermine religion and give priority to spirituality?
You'll see, Sri Aurobindo has used two words here. The seeker of integral knowledge will limit himself neither in his thought, nor in his practice, nor in his realization by any religious creed or philosophical dogma. So, two categories, religious creed and philosophical dogma. The distinction is this, that in the philosophical approach, the thought is more important, the ideas are more important. Whereas in the religious creed, the relationship with the divine is more important, the heart is more important, broadly speaking. If we have to categorize them and separate them, these would be the two major distinctions. So in all religious teaching, you will find there's a relationship with God, and then there are do's and don'ts in the relationship. There are things which you have to follow because that's what gets you closer to God or makes Him happy or whatever it is that the religion is trying to get to. Whereas the philosophies, they don't get into these issues. And that's why Buddhism can freely say it is not a religion. And it can stand back as superior because it is not a religion. It is even scientific because it is philosophical. It is a rational philosophical approach to liberation or realization of the absolute. Now you've actually directed yourself to God realization, but you've eliminated the word God and all the complexities which come with the devotional and the religious trappings. Here it is rational, and therefore you can yourself objectively validate and practice. And so it considers itself superior. On the other hand, certain religious traditions look down on it, saying that is a philosophy. It is not a religion. It does not put you in relationship with God. It is only a belief system and a series of practices from a belief system. So we are superior because we are a religion revealed by God, or which gives us these results in relation to God, and that is only a philosophy, and it puts it down. So you see how, depending on how you orient yourself, you can consider any of these more important than the other. But the difference is really which part of the consciousness is in greater prominence in the relationship. And so they basically catch one aspect, one facet, both in understanding and in relating to, and therefore subsequently in practice also. In most religions you will find do's and don'ts which are built in. Why? That's how it is. God said so, or some great founder said so, whatever form it takes. So you can't question it. The philosophy you can question and discuss and argue, but in the religion you cannot. So it becomes innately anti-rational. Eventually, almost every religious form will suppress thought and questioning because it can break the rules and the framework which is given to you. So you see, Sri Aurobindo, in this whole process, not only he has described experiences and led us through glimpses of the experiences, but also brought great clarity in our understanding. And this is a very important part of the integrality of the integral yoga. It's not enough that we feel and experience something. The experience must be included in all the parts of our being. And in the mind, if the experience has to be expressed, the mind must know in its terms, which is to know by distinctions, by right relation, through idea even. And so at the same time as we are reading, there is a clarity which comes in our mind. There is awakening in our feelings, the nature of the relationship, and then a particular formulation of the practice which we can apply at once. And it is touching all three levels at the same time as we are reading. And again, this is an error which people make while reading, that they read in the text only that aspect, that facet which resonates with them more. So those who are more bhakti oriented, they will read this and try to draw from it the bhakti content. And of course, it's harder to draw the bhakti content from this text which we have just read than in the yoga of love, where the whole text is suffused with the bhakti. This part of the text is reaching out much more to the mind's understanding and clarity, even as it fills it with the devotion. So they feel these portions somewhat dry and they move on quickly to the portions which get more juicy. Whereas the one who is more jnana yogi will read these and be delighted, and when he moves to the bhakti, he feels a little lost. What is this thing about mystery of the divine love? It doesn't make sense. All this is too clouded, too covered up in secrets and hidden, not made explicit, not made clear. I want to understand divine love. I want to understand how human love relates to divine love. So somehow he gets dissatisfied. But Sri Aurobindo brings there also the clarity of understanding, even in things of bhakti. But the reality is in all the texts, he is addressing all three levels at the same time. The mind grows clear and is filled with the joy of the perception, and with it the heart blooms to fill with this relationship that we have now with the fullness of the Self, the Lord, the Brahman. And we live in the unity, and the heart also begins to open in it, and the practice formulated from it also is very clearly given in its most essential form of the principle and how the principle turns to form. And so it allows for many variations. It's not limited to a very narrow form of the practice. So if we are conscious of all three as we read, we will see how he leads us into a complete integral education of the yoga and the experience of the yoga. So we continue this next Friday. Om.